At first glance, he looked like trouble, not a hero. Mohawk haircut, face painted in white stripes, a private who broke sergeants' noses, punched military police, refused to salute anyone he did not respect. The army tried to throw him out again and again, but every time the war got harder, they quietly moved him closer to the front. You jump from a burning plane on D-Day, land alone in the dark, scrape together a few scattered paratroopers, and take a key bridge against the odds. Then your own Air Force bombs that bridge in front of you and leaves you with 35 men, no food, no water, and 700 Germans coming uphill. If you stay with this story, you will find out how the Army's worst rule-breaker became the man who would not break in battle. Jake McNiece entered the world in Oklahoma during the hard years of the Great Depression. Life in those years shaped children early. Work started long before school, and jobs were taken before childhood ended. Jake came from a huge family, one of 10 siblings, and there was never enough money or food. Survival depended on skill and toughness. Hunting, fishing, and trapping were not hobbies. They were a way of keeping people fed. By the time Jake reached 10 years old, he already understood how to stalk animals through quiet woods, how to set snares, how to move without making a sound, and how to keep calm when things went wrong. These abilities belonged to a boy who learned responsibility far earlier than most. As he grew, Jake carried that resilience into his teen years. He became a firefighter at 19, a job that required quick reactions, teamwork, and courage. Many adults twice his age struggled to handle burning structures and collapsing beams. But Jake treated it the same way he treated everything else. You did the job that needed doing. You did not complain. You kept people alive if you could. His co-workers respected that toughness, even if they did not always understand him. Jake had a sharp edge. It showed up when orders sounded foolish, or when authority seemed more concerned with appearances than results. When the attack on Pearl Harbor came in December of 1941, Jake did not have to join the army. Firefighters were classified as essential workers and exempt from the draft. Yet, the decision came easily to him. He looked at the news, listened to people talk, and decided he was not going to sit home while the world burned. He did not use patriotic speeches or big political ideas to explain it. Later in life, he simply said that paratroopers got to jump behind enemy lines with explosives and take away the enemy's nice things. That mindset explained almost everything Jake did afterward. He traveled to Fort Benning for basic training. And from the moment he arrived, it became clear that he had trouble with military culture. Jake understood discipline when it meant doing something difficult or dangerous. He did not understand discipline when it meant standing perfectly still just because a man with a clipboard said so. During his first week, a staff sergeant took Jake's butter ration at breakfast. When Jake asked politely for it back, the sergeant told him to stop talking and finish his food. Jake responded by breaking the sergeant's nose. To him, the situation was simple. The man took something that belonged to him and refused to return it. Jake acted. The army, however, had a different way of looking at things. The same day, he set the speed record on the demolition training course. He ran faster than anyone in Fort Benning history. His commanding officer saw the contradiction clearly. Jake was the most gifted soldier in the class, and also the most frustrating. He refused to salute officers who had never seen combat. He ignored parade formations because he found them pointless. He rolled his eyes during morning flag ceremonies. When asked why he could not behave like a normal soldier, Jake explained plainly that he came to kill Germans, not to join what he called the dog and pony show. Officers wrote reports. Instructors shook their heads. Some saw potential. Others only saw trouble. Instead of removing him, leadership tried something unusual. They placed him in his own barracks, away from the rest of the unit. Whenever another soldier appeared, who was too difficult to discharge, but too useful to lose, that soldier was sent to Jake. At first it felt like punishment. Then it turned into something else. Over 6 months, Jake found himself in charge of men who looked just like him in every important way. They were stubborn, rough, and highly skilled. One was a coal miner with fists like sledgehammers. Another could speak 4 languages and had been caught running a black market. One had blown up a latrine just to study the blast pattern. Another had won 14 fights in basic training without losing once. Every man had a story. Every man was a problem for the army. And every man became part of Jake's small group. The army called them discipline cases. Jake called them exactly the kind of people he wanted beside him in battle. He understood that obedience and discipline did not mean the same thing. Obedience was doing what you were told. Discipline was doing what needed to be done, even when no one was watching. Under Jake's direction, the group trained harder than any regular platoon. They shot more accurately, ran farther, and carried heavier loads without complaint. If someone could not keep up, Jake removed him without hesitation. Everyone understood the rule. Competence kept you alive. Pride did not matter. Ego did not matter. Only skill and effort counted. Officers at Fort Benning complained constantly. Jake's group broke social rules, ignored uniform standards, skipped formalities, and challenged authority. They often looked like they had crawled out of a ditch, yet when it came time to test the entire Airborne division on marksmanship, demolitions, ruck marching, and hand-to-hand fighting, Jake's group outperformed every other unit. They failed only one category: uniform inspections. They did not care. Right before the unit left for England, Jake landed himself in another fight with military police. 2 MPs tried to arrest one of his men in a bar. Jake stepped in and ended the argument by breaking both MPs' jaws. When a furious officer threatened to punish him, Jake offered a bargain. He would attempt the 136-mile ruck march between Fort Benning and another base. If he completed it, the charges would disappear. The officer agreed, believing it impossible. Jake finished the march 10 days later, wearing full gear without a single blister. His feet looked untouched, as if he had walked only a few miles. Army doctors were astonished. The officer kept his word. By early 1944, Jake and his men sailed to England to prepare for the largest airborne operation in history. They hunted illegally, ate better than most officers, and once again caused trouble. Yet when the night before D-Day arrived, and photographers captured their painted faces and mohawk haircuts, it became obvious to everyone watching that these soldiers were unlike any other. They were loud, wild, rebellious, and skilled, and their most difficult test was about to begin. England, in early 1944, felt different from Fort Benning. The training fields were colder, the trees older, and the countryside stretched in long, rolling hills that reminded Jake of Oklahoma only in the quiet moments. His men settled into camp quickly, but their habits did not change. They still trained harder than anyone. They still ignored formal rules they considered pointless. And they still found inventive ways to get into trouble without meaning to. British food rationing surprised them most. Meat was rare. Sugar was rationed. Fresh vegetables were a luxury. Jake studied the rations handed out each week and knew immediately they would not keep his men strong for a combat jump. He walked through the countryside with the same eyes he had used as a boy in Oklahoma. There were rabbits, deer, and pheasants. Streams held fish. Forests hid game trails. To Jake, this looked like an invitation, not a boundary. Soon his men were eating better than they ever had. Jake hunted deer with his M1 rifle. He trapped rabbits using wire and sticks. Sometimes he used small amounts of military explosives to make fishing faster, a method that left British officers speechless. The British landowners, however, were not confused. They were furious. Complaints reached the American command, and a formal lawsuit accused American soldiers of poaching royal game. Jake's commanding officer summoned him and asked if he had anything to say. Jake explained calmly that his men needed proper nutrition before jumping into France. The officer asked what he expected him to do about the lawsuit. Jake replied that the officer might as well send him on a dangerous mission because he would not stop hunting. The conversation ended there. No punishment followed. Life inside the unit became its own world. Jake's 13 misfits gathered under one roof every morning. They drilled until sweat darkened the ground under their boots. They practiced hand signals in silence. They carried heavy rucksacks through the English countryside. Their bond came from shared experiences, bruised knuckles, and a belief that in real combat only skill and will mattered. Officers from other units watched them with a mixture of curiosity and worry. These soldiers looked wild, unshaven, and unpredictable. Their barracks smelled like gun oil, tobacco, and rabbit stew. Yet when it came time to demonstrate combat readiness, none of the regular units could match their performance. As D-Day approached, pressure grew across every airborne camp in England. Night exercises increased. Pilots trained for low-altitude jumps. Paratroopers packed and repacked parachutes until the fabric felt like part of their skin. Jake's group treated the coming operation with a calm that confused outsiders. They were not fearless. They used those memories to steady themselves. The famous photographs taken before the Normandy jump did not come from any military plan. A war correspondent saw Jake shaving his hair into a mohawk. He saw the white stripes Jake painted across his face. Then he watched Jake's men do the same. The correspondent raised his camera and took the pictures that would become symbols of D-Day. Americans back home would look at those photos and imagine warriors preparing for the greatest invasion in history. Jake's men simply felt they were preparing for a job, one that required nerve and absolute focus. On the night of June 5th, the men gathered near the C-47 transport planes that would carry them into France. Engines hummed in the dark. The air smelled of fuel and damp grass. The ground crews moved quietly between parked aircraft, checking lights and fuel levels. Pilots leaned over maps inside the cockpits. The atmosphere felt heavy, not from fear but from the weight of expectation. Everyone understood the scale of the coming battle, even if few could imagine the reality. Inside the aircraft, the filthy 13 checked gear with practiced hands. Rifle magazines were stacked and secured. Bayonets were strapped in place. Demolition charges were wrapped. Parachutes were examined again and again. Jake moved down the line, looking at each man. He understood better than most that some of them would not survive the night. He did not speak about it. He did not give speeches. He trusted their training and their will. As the aircraft lifted into the sky, the men felt the change immediately. The ground fell away. The engines grew louder. They crossed the English Channel in complete darkness, broken only by the faint glow of navigation lights. Sweat formed on hands gripping static lines. The aircraft rocked gently at first, then violently as anti-aircraft fire reached them. Red and white tracers cut through the air. Flashes from German guns lit the clouds. Jake felt the aircraft shudder. He heard metal tear. Someone shouted a warning. The pilot tried to hold altitude, but another explosion struck the tail. The aircraft split apart, flinging men into the night sky before they were ready. Jake felt the shockwave hit him. His body lifted and twisted. Then the blackness swallowed him as he fell through burning debris. His parachute opened late. One panel shredded, another half burned. He hit the ground hard, sinking into a flooded field that closed around him like a fist. Gear dragged him down. Mud smothered him. He cut his straps quickly and forced his face above the water. He inhaled desperately, tasting smoke, mud. Around him the night pulsed with gunfire. Parachutes drifted uselessly into German positions. Burning fragments of aircraft fell like dying stars. The sky glowed orange. The ground trembled with distant explosions. Jake lifted his rifle from the water, checked the action, and moved through the darkness, searching for anyone still alive. 4 were dead. Others were scattered miles away. The remaining 9 listened quietly as Jake described the mission. They needed to take a bridge across the Murderette River. Intelligence claimed about 200 Germans were guarding it. Jake looked at the 9 exhausted faces around him and made a simple decision. They were going to attack anyway. That single choice marked the beginning of the battle that would define Jake McNiece, the Filthy 13, and the legend that would follow them through Normandy. Jake and his 9 survivors moved through the wet morning fields with quiet determination. The air smelled of smoke, dirt, and burning fuel. Every step felt heavy after the chaos of the night, but each man understood the mission. They had been trained for confusion. They had been trained to fight while scattered. They had been trained to gather whoever survived and strike where the enemy least expected it. The flooded ground sucked at their boots as they climbed out of the marsh and pushed toward the hedgerows leading to the Murderate River. Small bursts of rifle fire echoed across distant farms. Explosions thudded from unseen fields. Paratroopers shouted in French towns they had never heard of. Cars burned. Barns smoldered. German soldiers moved through orchards trying to regroup. Jake kept his squad low, using hedges and ruined stone walls to mask their approach. His mind worked with the same instincts he honed as a child tracking animals. He looked for broken branches, disturbed leaves, fresh footprints, and anything that suggested German patrols. At one point he stopped the group near a cluster of apple trees. He knelt and examined the ground. The dirt showed small circular depressions from boots with hobnails, the kind used by German infantry. The tracks led east, toward the bridge they needed to seize. Jake let the men rest their legs briefly while he studied the pattern. It suggested a recent movement, possibly half a squad. They were heading toward a defensive position. Jake signaled silently, and his men tightened their formation. They advanced carefully, weaving through the thick Norman bocage. The hedgerows acted like green walls, blocking vision and turning the countryside into a maze. It favored defenders, yet Jake used it to hide movement. When they reached an opening, he crouched and scanned the distance. A machine gun nest sat behind a low stone wall near a barn. 2 Germans lay prone, watching the road. Jake recognized an opportunity before his men even spotted the enemy. He instructed 2 of his best shooters with hand signals. It took less than a minute for the shots to ring out. Both Germans fell before they could react. The squad advanced across the field, cleared the barn, and retrieved ammunition. The engagement was quick, silent, and controlled. It showed the strength of Jake's leadership. With only 9 men, he turned chaos into opportunity. By late morning, the group reached a hill overlooking the Murderate River. The bridge at Chef Dupont sat below them, a simple crossing with stone supports and narrow railings. Smoke drifted from a German outpost on the far bank. The area looked quiet, but Jake knew numbers could deceive. Intelligence claimed 200 defenders guarded the site. Even if that number was exaggerated, it meant serious trouble. He crawled to the crest and observed the terrain. The ground sloped gently toward the river. Trees offered partial cover. A cluster of farm buildings sat nearby. Germans could use those structures to mount a defense or as staging areas for counterattacks. Jake examined the riverbank, looking for weak points or blind angles. He imagined the enemy's vantage point. He imagined what they would expect from an American assault. He imagined how to exploit every gap. Once he had a rough plan, he gathered the men behind a hedge and described the movements. Then used the confusion to push quickly toward the bridge. The goal was speed. Hesitation meant death. Every man nodded. They knew this was not a mission for a large unit. This was work for small teams that understood how to move like shadows. The attack began, with Jake crawling under a fence into a cabbage field. His men spread out behind him, rifles at the ready. Birds scattered as distant artillery shook the ground. When he reached the edge of the field, he saw 2 Germans smoking near a truck. A short burst from a bar cut them down. The squad rushed forward before the echoes faded. More Germans appeared in doorways and windows. Bullets cracked past the Americans as they bounded from cover to cover, shifting angles faster than the defenders could adjust. Jake reached the base of the bridge first. He fired from behind a stone post, hitting a German who tried to set up a machine gun. His men pushed across the road and cleared a nearby trench. Smoke drifted through the air. German voices shouted orders from somewhere upriver. The Americans worked with precision, using short bursts and controlled fire to keep the enemy disorganized. By mid-morning, the bridge was theirs. More scattered paratroopers, hearing the gunfire, drifted toward the fight. With a larger force, they secured the far bank and prepared for the inevitable counterattack. Jake looked at his men and felt a brief moment of pride. The droning hum of aircraft engines approached from the east. At first, the paratroopers cheered, believing help had arrived. The aircraft flew low, coming directly toward the bridge. Sunlight glinted off their wings. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. Then, the bombs fell. Jake watched the ground erupt in fire and dust. The bridge he had fought for collapsed into the river in a roar of shattered stone and boiling water. Men ducked, shielding their faces from flying debris. A shockwave rolled across the riverbank. When the smoke cleared, the crossing lay in the water as a broken skeleton of stone and steel. The mission they risked their lives for had vanished in seconds. Silence followed. A strange, stunned silence. Then Jake started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity hit him all at once. They had captured a bridge their own air force decided to destroy. Now they were deep behind enemy lines, cut off, outnumbered, and stranded without a clear mission. He looked at the ruined bridge, and then at the hills around them. The land rose sharply on the near side. High ground, natural choke points, a place where numbers mattered less than angles. Jake's mind shifted instantly from attack to survival. If they could not leave, they would make the enemy pay for every step. That decision set the stage for the 3 hardest days Jake McNiece and his men had ever faced. Jake studied the broken bridge for only a moment before turning his eyes to the land around it. The river ran low and slow beneath the ruined stone, spreading out in soft currents that reflected the morning light. The opposite bank held German forces regrouping after the blast. The near bank, however, rose into a slope of thick grass, scattered trees, and a narrow trail that twisted upward toward a ridge. Jake walked the slope slowly, touching the earth with his boots, feeling its shape, and letting instinct guide him. He knew from childhood that land could be an ally or an enemy. Here, it offered a chance. The hill held 3 natural choke points. Each was tight, narrow, and forced any attacking force to bunch together before reaching the top. To Jake, the area looked like a funnel built by nature itself. If soldiers climbed too fast, they exposed themselves. If they moved too slowly, they bunched into a tight cluster. If they tried to flank, the slope dropped steeply on both sides, turning the attempt into a slide toward open ground. With the right positions, a small group could hold a much larger one. He brought the men together and explained the plan. They moved quickly, digging shallow foxholes along the crest and setting up firing positions behind logs, rocks, and dirt mounds. 2 machine gun teams placed their weapons where the fields of fire overlapped. Riflemen spread out with clear lines of sight. Bar gunners covered support weapons that might appear on the far bank. Jake kept a small group of 5 in reserve, ready to move wherever pressure grew strongest. The men were exhausted, hungry, and covered in grime, but they trusted Jake's judgment. They worked without complaint, scraping dirt with helmets, sharpening edges on firing pits, and packing earth to support their rifles. Their faces were streaked with sweat, mud, and long hours of tension. They carried only what they jumped with. Ammunition was low. Food was gone. Water came from puddles. Yet no one spoke about surrender. German scouts appeared by late morning. They moved carefully across the rubble of the bridge, spotting the Americans dug into the high ground. Jake lay in his foxhole and watched the man sweep the hillside with slow, deliberate motions. When their eyes met, even at a distance, Jake felt the strange calm that settled in him during dangerous moments. The scout lowered the binoculars and retreated to report what he saw. The first sign of negotiation came early the next day. A German officer rode forward on horseback, holding a white flag. Behind him stretched a force of several hundred soldiers. Machine guns, mortars, and support teams filled the riverbank. Jake met him halfway. The officer spoke firmly, explaining that the Americans were surrounded with no supplies, no escape, and no hope of reinforcement. He suggested surrender as the only logical option. Jake listened without emotion. His men had spent 3 days eating grass. They had fought through burning aircraft wreckage. They had captured a bridge, only to watch it vanish under friendly bombs. Logic, to them, meant little. When the officer finished speaking, Jake told him plainly that his men were irritated, hungry, and dug into perfect positions. He was free to do so. The German stared at him, confused by the calm tone. Then he turned and returned to his lines. When the attack began, the sound of boots and shouted commands rolled across the river. Jake lay flat in his foxhole, breathing slowly, waiting for the right moment. The Germans moved in large numbers, advancing up the choke points exactly as Jake had predicted. Their formation tightened as they climbed. Rifles and machine guns carried by the enemy caught the light in small flashes. Dust rose behind them. Jake waited until the enemy reached the 100-yard mark before giving the signal. His machine gunners opened fire first. The chatter of the guns broke the still air, sending long streams of tracers down the slope. The effect was immediate. German soldiers fell in clusters. Those in the back pushed forward, while those in front tried to dive for cover. But there was no real cover. The choke points offered little protection. Riflemen fired disciplined shots, each aimed and each necessary. These men had trained for speed and accuracy, not random bursts. Bar gunners targeted German teams trying to set up support positions. Without covering fire, the German infantry could not steady themselves. In minutes, the attack fell apart. Survivors retreated down the slope, the hillside filled with smoke and wounded cries. Jake's men checked themselves. Not a single casualty. The second attack came later, accompanied by mortars. Explosions pounded the forward slope, throwing dirt and splinters into the air. Jake had placed his men behind the crest, where the angle made mortar fire far less deadly. The ground shook, trees rattled, and debris rained down. Yet when the barrage ended, the men rose from their holes and prepared to fire again. The next wave climbed with more caution. German leaders shouted orders, urging their men forward. They advanced slowly, rifles raised, trying to find angles the Americans could not cover. But Jake's overlapping fields of fire turned every advance into a new disaster. Once more, the hillside lit with gunfire. Once more, the attack collapsed. By the afternoon, the Germans brought tanks. Their 75mm guns fired into the hillside, but the shells struck the forward slope and exploded harmlessly below the American line. The tanks continued to advance, their armor glinting under the sun. Infantry followed closely behind, hoping to use the steel giants as mobile shields. Jake watched the scene carefully. He understood immediately that the tanks were not his real problem. The infantry behind them were. He signaled his machine gun teams. They ignored the tanks and aimed directly at the soldiers, using them for cover. They became trapped in a corridor where they had height but no angle. They could not elevate their guns enough to hit Jake's positions. They fired again and again, each shell pounding uselessly against the lower slope. Meanwhile, the infantry around them fell to concentrated American fire. After half an hour of noise, smoke, and wasted shells, the tanks retreated, unable to find targets and lacking infantry support. Jake's men exhaled but did not relax. They knew another attack could come at any moment. When night fell, the hillside lay quiet, except for the distant moans of wounded Germans. The moon rose above the ridgeline, casting faint light across broken weapons and torn earth. Jake walked the line, checking each position, speaking quietly, making sure his men stayed alert. They had held off multiple attacks. They were thirsty, starving, and covered in dirt. But their spirits remained strong. These 35 men had faced overwhelming numbers and impossible conditions. Yet the hill still belonged to them, and Jake knew the next day would test them even further. Dawn on June 9th arrived slowly, the sky turning pale grey before light spread across the scarred hillside. Jake's men lay in their foxholes with stiff backs and dry mouths, listening to the distant movement of German troops preparing for another attempt. The cold air carried the smell of gunpowder, wet grass, and smoke lingering from the previous day's fighting. Every man understood that the enemy would return in greater strength. Their only choice was to be ready. Jake scanned the slope from behind a fallen tree. he had dragged into position the night before. He studied every angle the way a hunter studies a clearing. The ground in front of them was uneven, with tall grass, patches of dirt, and scattered rocks. These features slowed attackers and forced them into predictable paths. That was what kept his men alive. Land was shaping the outcome more than numbers or firepower. Jake trusted the terrain more than he trusted maps or orders. It never lied, never boasted, never failed when understood correctly. The Germans began their new advance with more discipline than before. Officers barked commands. Soldiers formed a broader line, spacing themselves to avoid bunching. Mortars thumped in the distance, sending shells arcing toward the hill. Explosions rolled across the forward slope, carving craters and throwing clumps of dirt into the air. Jake's men kept their heads down, staying behind the crest. The earth shook, but the shells struck low again, unable to reach the reverse side where the defenders waited. The barrage was loud, frightening, and impressive, yet it changed nothing. As the mortar fire stopped, German riflemen moved uphill. Their boots crushed dead grass and loose stones, creating a steady rhythm. Jake inhaled slowly and raised his hand. He waited. He measured the distance with his eyes. He listened to the sound of their movement, trying to sense the exact moment when the enemy committed fully to the climb. Then he dropped his hand. The hillside erupted with fire. Machine guns hammered first, their barrels spitting hot metal in controlled bursts. The tracers traced red lines through the morning air, slicing into the advancing troops with precise angles. Riflemen fired in steady rhythms, each shot aimed, each shot purposeful. Bar gunners sprayed short bursts to keep the enemy from spreading or flanking. Smoke drifted upward in thin columns. The German front line collapsed quickly. But this time, survivors did not retreat immediately. Some hid behind rocks or scooped shallow depressions in the earth, hoping to crawl forward. Jake watched their movements and shifted his reserve group to strengthen the middle of the line. His men reacted with practiced teamwork, supporting each other without wasting words. Their nerves were tight but steady from experience. They had lived through worse than bullets. A sudden rush of German grenades rolled across the slope. Jake shouted for everyone to stay low. Explosions popped in uneven patterns. Dirt sprayed over the foxholes. The concussion made ears ring. Still, the line held. The Germans tried to exploit the chaos by pushing forward, but Jake's machine guns cut them down again. When the survivors finally withdrew, the slope was marked with torn uniforms, broken rifles, and wounded soldiers crawling away from the fight. The second attack ended as decisively as the first. Jake checked his men. They had small cuts, bruises, and ringing ears. But no one was hit by bullets or shrapnel. Their luck came from preparation, matched with the cruel advantage of elevation. Jake silently thanked the hill. By midday, German frustration was clear. Officers shouted more angrily. Runners dashed between mortar teams. Machine gun crews repositioned weapons along the tree line. Then the forest trembled as German artillery joined the fight. These shells were heavier, larger, and louder. They crashed into the hillside in waves, sending eruption after eruption of dirt skyward. The ground trembled under the impacts. One tree snapped and fell, sending branches across a foxhole. Jake's men stayed low. They gripped their rifles and waited out the bombardment. They knew movement during the barrage meant death. After long minutes of shaking earth, the artillery grew quiet again. Smoke drifted across the ridge. A strange stillness settled in. The next German assault began with a roar of engines. 2 tanks rolled into view from behind the far ridge. Their tracks ground over rubble as they moved toward the narrow road that led up the slope. Infantry followed closely behind, using the armored giants for cover. Dust rose around them as they advanced. Jake understood immediately that the tanks were dangerous only if backed by infantry. Without infantry, they were loud but limited. He watched the first tank reach the narrow defile. It tried to angle its turret upward, but the slope prevented the gun from rising enough to hit the American line. Its shells slammed into the lower hillside again and again, each explosion exploding harmlessly below the crest. Jake signaled his machine gun teams. They opened fire on the infantry behind the tanks, not on the steel itself. German soldiers fell quickly as they attempted to spread out. Those trying to lay down covering fire were cut down by riflemen who had been waiting for this exact moment. One tank continued to fire blindly, unable to see the enemy. The other halted, unsure whether to advance or pull back. Without infantry support, tanks became useless. After half an hour of firing into empty dirt, the armored vehicles backed away slowly, disappearing behind the trees. The hillside grew quiet once more. Jake exhaled and wiped dirt from his face. His men looked exhausted but alive. Their faces were streaked with grime and sweat. Their canteens were nearly empty. Their stomachs had tightened from hunger, yet their confidence grew with each failed attack. They had endured mortars, artillery, and tanks without losing a single man. By late afternoon, the Germans attempted a final push. They gathered their remaining strength and rushed the slope with everything they had left. The fight lasted minutes, not hours. The hillside echoed with the sharp crack of rifles and the steady rhythm of machine guns. When the Germans retreated for the last time, the battle that had begun with overwhelming numbers ended in silence. As night fell, a soft wind blew across the hill. Jake's men sat in their foxholes, tired beyond measure, but still alert. No one spoke loudly. No one boasted. They simply waited for whatever came next, knowing they had turned a hopeless ridge into a fortress through grit, instinct, and the stubborn refusal to quit. The hill had not fallen, and neither had they. By the morning of June 10th, the ridge that Jake's men defended looked like the scar of a storm. Grass had been shredded by bullets. Craters dotted the earth. Burned branches hung from trees like torn cloth. The air still smelled of smoke and damp soil. Jake stood at the crest of the hill, scanning the slope where so many German soldiers had fallen. Drained from the fight but alive. They had no food left, no water left, and barely any ammunition. Yet they held the line with a calm that came only from surviving what should have killed them. When American reinforcements finally arrived through the hedgerows, the new troops looked at Jake's 35 men with stunned disbelief. They expected to find a battered, half-destroyed force. Instead, they found soldiers covered in dirt but standing strong. Rifles ready, eyes sharp. Officers asked Jake how many casualties his unit had suffered. The officers thought he misunderstood the question. They repeated it. Jake gave the same answer. 0. The hillside told another story, scattered with bodies and torn equipment belonging only to the enemy. After the ridge was secured, Jake's men ate their first real meal in days. They drank water until their stomachs hurt. Some lay on the grass, staring at the sky as if the clouds themselves were a miracle. Others cleaned their weapons, unwilling to let adrenaline fade completely. Jake walked the line, checking each foxhole one more time, as if the land itself deserved acknowledgement. He did not think of medals. He did not think of praise. In his eyes, the day was simply another job finished. Months passed as the war spread across France, then moved toward Belgium. The filthy 13 changed with the fighting. Some men were wounded, others were transferred or killed. By autumn of 1944, only a few original members remained beside Jake. Yet his reputation grew even as his circle grew smaller. Officers used his name when they needed impossible tasks completed. Soldiers whispered his stories around campfires, unsure which parts were true and which parts were exaggerated. Jake ignored all of it. He focused on the next task. In December of that year, disaster struck in the Ardennes. German forces launched a massive counteroffensive through the snowy forests. The attack pushed deep into American lines, surrounding entire divisions. 11,000 American troops were cut off inside it, low on ammunition, low on food, and nearly out of hope. Every supply road was captured. Every path was blocked by German units. Without resupply, the town would fall, and the German advance would punch a hole straight through the Allied front. The army searched for volunteers to jump into the encircled town as pathfinders. The job required setting up radio equipment in the middle of enemy fire and guiding supply planes through heavy fog. No one expected many volunteers. It was as close to a suicide mission as airborne units had attempted since Normandy. On December 18th, at a time before sunrise, he boarded a C-47 with 9 other pathfinders. The cold air seeped into their gloves and coats. Fog covered the landscape. The pilot warned that visibility was almost zero, and German anti-aircraft guns surrounded the town. Jake sat silently, checking his gear one last time. He felt the familiar calm settle over him. Danger did not frighten him. Uncertainty did not shake him. He had jumped through burning aircraft before. He had fought outnumbered before. This mission felt like an extension of everything he had already done. At 7:23 in the morning, the plane reached Bastogne. The pilot could see nothing through the dense clouds. The jumpmaster hesitated, unsure whether to order the men out. Jake moved to the door and jumped first, trusting the ground to appear eventually. His chute opened above the fog. A moment later, he dropped through the white curtain and saw buildings, artillery craters, and American soldiers firing from snowy trenches. He hit the ground hard but unhurt. Men nearby stared at him in disbelief. No one expected anyone to parachute into a surrounded town. He asked where his team had landed. Some were inside the perimeter. Others were scattered or missing. Jake spent the next hour and a half running through shellfire and ruined streets to gather whoever survived. He found 8 pathfinders. 2 were gone. With 8 men, he could still complete the mission. Jake split them into 2 teams. One operated on the east side of town. The other stayed on the west side. They set up radio beacons and switched frequencies constantly to avoid German triangulation. Snow fell steadily. German shells burst in the fog. The air tasted like burnt metal. Yet, the radios worked. At 10:17, Jake sent the first message. Bastogne was still holding. Supplies were needed immediately. And not long after, the first supply plane arrived. It came in low, cutting through the clouds blindly, guided only by Jake's radio signal. German guns opened fire. Tracers carved bright lines in the sky. The C-47 released its bundles and pulled away. More planes followed. Dozens came throughout the day. Then, hundreds. Jake and his team guided 247 successful supply drops into Bastogne over several days. Food landed. Ammunition landed. Medical supplies landed. Everything the defenders needed arrived, because one stubborn paratrooper refused to let a surrounded town starve. When Patton's forces finally broke through on December 26th, the men of Bastogne were still alive and still fighting. Their survival became one of the turning points of the war. Jake received no medal for the mission. Pathfinder operations were classified. He did not complain. Recognition meant nothing to him. People living meant everything. After the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Jake drifted through occupation duty. He rode Hermann Goering's stolen horses, drank expensive liquor found in abandoned mansions, and tried to pretend that peace felt normal. It did not. When he returned home to Oklahoma, the quiet felt heavier than gunfire. Civilian life proved harder than combat. He struggled with memories that arrived without warning. He drank too much. A drunk driving accident nearly killed him in 1951. Surviving that crash forced him to rethink everything. He quit drinking, found God in a quiet and simple way, married a woman named Mary Catherine, and raised 3 children. He worked at the Ponca City Post Office for 40 years, selling stamps and sorting mail. His co-workers never knew the truth. His children never heard the full story. He never bragged, never explained, and never wanted to. Jake McNiece died in 2013 at 93 years old. The man who broke rules, broke jaws, broke German lines, and broke every expectation the army had of him finally found peace. He had wanted to kill Nazis, eat breakfast, and go home. In the end, he accomplished all 3.